So after 23 long months of speculation, how did the news media handle the highly anticipated release of the Mueller report?
Joining us with his take is someone who has often been critical of the reporting on this matter in Washington, D.C. and across the country. Glenn Greenwald, the co-founding editor of the Intercept. He joins us now via Skype. Glenn, great to see you.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, any surprises with the fact that once the report finally came out last week, it's not just that there were no apologies from a lot of very, very prominent news outlets, but CNN, Washington Post, and others had people say that they basically got it all right.
I find that genuinely stunning as somebody who's been a pretty harsh media critic for more than a decade. My bar for their behavior is, I think, rather low, and yet they somehow descended beneath it. The reality is that for 3 years, there has been a conspiracy theory that has dominated our political and media discourse, which is that Donald Trump conspired with Russia over the 2016 election and that he's an agent of the Russian government, along with many of his associates. In the Mueller report, in one section after the next, said either they couldn't establish that or there was no evidence for it. And yet they're acting as though it said exactly the opposite, that this conspiracy theory was demonstrated and proven and vindicated. And they're living in some kind of bizarre fantasy land because they're worried that admitting they got the story wrong will damage their credibility, but pretending that they got it right is just worsening the problem.
So Mayor Giuliani has been making the rounds, of course, making the case for the president. Let's take a listen a little bit of what he's been saying about the actual content of the report.
There's nothing wrong with taking information from Russians.
There's nothing wrong with taking
information. Depends on where it came from. It depends on where it came from. You're assuming that the giving of information is a campaign contribution. You read the report carefully. The report says we can't conclude that because the law is pretty much against that. People get information from this person, that person?
So you would have accepted information from Russians against a client, against a candidate if you were running in the presidential election?
I probably wouldn't. I wasn't asked. I would have advised, just out of excess of caution, don't do it.
So the wild conspiracy theories here were obviously totally wrong. But do you agree with Mayor Giuliani that there's nothing wrong with taking information from the Russians? And is there other behavior detailed in the report that you find troubling?
I do agree with him that there's nothing wrong with taking information from the Russians. First of all, every media outlet that is feigning so much outrage over that statement themselves used information that they believed at the time came from Russian hackers and reported on it, put it in headlines, attracted all kinds of traffic from it, profited off of it, benefited from it, because the information was in the public interest. At the same time, the Democrats had representatives in Ukraine working with Ukrainian government officials to try and get dirt on Paul Manafort and Donald Trump, and got it, and forced Manafort from their role. So yeah, I think when you're running for president and somebody comes to you and says, I have true information that shows corruption on the part of your opponent, of course everybody would take that information. Journalists, that's a creed of journalism to do it. And I guess the question I would put to everybody is, if in 2020, some country that is hostile to Donald Trump, like Venezuela or Ukraine or the Palestinians, has their hackers obtain Donald Trump's tax returns and financial statements showing severe corruption, and comes to the Democrats or journalists and says, I want to give you this specifically to help Donald Trump lose because it shows what a crook he is anyone going to say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't want this information because it comes from a foreign government trying to meddle in? Of course not. They're going to say, yeah, please hand that over. You can question, of course, whether it's unethical or criminal to hack. It is. But once that information is available and it's in the public interest, it's the duty of people to make that public rather than to conceal it and cover it up.
What about on the obstruction of justice section of the report, Glenn? What was your view there?
I think that the obstruction of justice section corroborated what pretty much everybody has long known about Donald Trump, which is that he's bereft of any ethical constraints, that he's willing to lie and cheat and engage in corrupt behavior in order to promote his own interest. If anybody was surprised by that, that's pretty scary. I think that, as a criminal matter, to say, look, it is different when it's the head of the executive branch thinking about how to deal with an investigation being conducted by his subordinate he made no secret of the fact that he wanted to stop this investigation. He talked about it every single day on Twitter, said that the investigation was a hoax and a scam and was a witch hunt. So I don't think it's a surprise that he wanted to stop the investigation. The question becomes, why did he want to do that? Was it because he was trying to conceal evidence of underlying criminality? Well, the Mueller report said there's no evidence to suggest there was underlying criminality. Or was it because he genuinely believed that the investigation was improper because it was based on allegations that were untrue? And I think it's the latter assumption that was borne out. And so, yeah, I don't think we should want presidents encouraging people to lie or thwart investigations. But I do think the fact that the investigation was, the genesis of it was allegations that proved to be untrue is very relevant to the question of whether he ought to be impeached, let alone prosecuted for having done it.
Glenn, also wanted to get your thoughts on Julian Assange. There's obviously a lot of different opinions that really cross political lines in this country about, is he a journalist? Should he be charged? Is this just people in power that are lashing out against somebody that has been a warrior for transparency? There's all these, you're very familiar with all these different arguments. There is one component of this that ties in the Mueller probe, and that is the allegation that Julian Assange is effectively an intelligence cutout for the Russian intelligence services. What do you make of that, and would that change? Do you believe that that's true? Do you think that that still has yet to be adjudicated, and would that change your feelings about whether Julian Assange is in fact a journalist?
So, first of all, the question, is somebody a journalist, to me is a kind of misleading or unhelpful way to begin the discussion. It's not, the First Amendment does not provide a guarantee of a free press only to a small group of licensed, credentialed people called journalists. There are professions where you have to be licensed and credentialed to claim that status, like to be a doctor or to be a lawyer, but that's not true of journalism. Freedom of the press was available for everybody. Every citizen has the right of a free press, not just this priesthood called journalists. So is someone a journalist or not, I think is generally an unhelpful way of looking at things. What bothers me about the indictment is that, and of course the indictment has nothing to do with anything he did in 2016, it's only about the 2010 leaks from Chelsea Manning, is that so much of what's in the indictment, encouraging a source to get more documents, helping a source cover her tracks in order not to be detected, are things that journalists do every single day. You can say journalists don't typically help a source hack into a password in order to get, a better way of hiding her identity, but helping a source avoid detection is definitely something journalists are not just entitled to do, but obligated to do. And that's why press freedom groups around the world are so concerned about this indictment. The other thing I would say is there's nothing in the Mueller report that says that WikiLeaks had any reason to believe the information they got actually came from the Russians. The Mueller report does say that the hack was originally done by the Russian government, but there's nothing in the report that says that WikiLeaks had any reason to believe that the people with whom they were communicating to get this information were actually agents of the Russian government. And again, I would just point out that any journalist who was contacted by an agent of a Russian government and said, I have dirt on Donald Trump, would say, oh, please give it to me so that I can report it. So I'm not even sure, even if there were evidence of that, that would be particularly incriminating.
Glenn, where do you think Democrats should go from here? There's renewed interest from Senator Warren and others in impeachment. What is your view?
I think that trying to impeach a president for lying in the absence of an underlying crime is both substantively wrong and politically unwise. That, of course, should have been the lesson of the Republicans' unsuccessful attempt to impeach President Clinton, who did absolutely lie while testifying, who lied to investigators, who obstructed investigators, but ultimately committed no underlying crime. He was just trying to hide politically embarrassing information. And people felt like, look, we have this huge, extremely expensive election that we all pour our hearts and souls into. We shouldn't nullify the results unless some serious criminality is demonstrated. To be honest, I don't think anyone believes the Democrats are going to impeach Trump. Obviously, nobody believes that the Senate is going to convict him, absent some evidence that Robert Mueller never found after 22 months. So I think this is just a case of individual political presidential candidates who aren't doing very well in the polls trying to distinguish themselves by standing up and saying, I'm in favor of impeachment. But I really seriously doubt that the Democrats are going to do it, and I don't think they ought to, both substantively or politically.
Glenn, thanks so much. Always good to see you.
We appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Next on Rising, even before the actual Mueller report came out, House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler requested Robert Mueller's testimony on the report.
Former Deputy Assistant AG Elliot Williams discusses how that legal fight might play out and the ongoing cases from the special counsel, including Roger Stone's. We'll get into all that as Rising rolls on.